Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you to the August 2019 edition of this month's PASS HADR virtual chapter. So we're going to start with a little bit of routine housekeeping, and then we'll turn this over to Rob. So first of all, the call for speakers with PASS Summit 2019, the sessions have been announced. Bottom line, if you're not attending this, make plans, talk to your employers. If there's anything we can do to help, let me know. These are phenomenal events. It's one I won't miss. You need to be there. Just PASS Summit is amazing. So at the bottom of the screen there, check this out. Go look at all the exciting events, sessions for this particular conference. You gotta go. You just gotta go. If you can go, please use our registration code here. It'll save you $150. This virtual chapter benefits every time you use these. PASS benefits, you benefit, your career benefits, your employer benefits, everybody wins. They have actually introduced something new. They're calling this the PASS Summit All Access. And go to the link at the bottom of the screen there to go check this out. It sounds really cool. Okay, upcoming virtual group webinars. We're not the only virtual group out there, in case you didn't know. The DBA's fundamental one is meeting tomorrow with Anthony Nosotino. Data architecture is tomorrow. Cloud, DBA fundamentals, women in technology, cloud, all of these in the next week. But a bunch more with cloud here coming up, which is just really exciting. More DBA fundamentals all the way every month, pretty much every week of every month. There are phenomenal virtual groups out there, in addition to the on-prem local user groups that you've got. Register for these, watch them. You can go back and watch the recordings. They're just amazing. If you've not heard of a SQL Saturday, you need to go check these out as well. These are regional events taking place all over the world. There's a bunch here in the US coming up. They're all over the place. I'm going to be at the Kansas City one on September 14th. They're just a lot of fun. They're completely free, small charge for lunch if you want it. You need to go. Again, it's world-class information, great networking, great people, completely free. If you are looking for a new career or looking to recruit some really good technical talent, go check out pass.org/careers. Just phenomenal information. And then connect with PASS. Chances are you're already a member of PASS. If not, register today out at pass.org. They're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. Just an incredible community. It's the biggest reason why I'm here. The community is just amazing. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn this over to Rob Volk. So this is SQL Server log shipping with Rob Volk. And there you go.
All right, David. Great, thank you. Let me know when you can see.
I can.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending this afternoon, if you're in an afternoon time zone, or evening, if you're in an evening time zone. So I'm going to discuss the log shipping feature in SQL Server during this presentation. And there we go. So just a little bit about myself. I'm Rob Volk. I have been a SQL Server user since 1998, so 21 years, version 6.5. I've been a DBA most of the last, say, 15 years, primarily. I'm one of the SQL Saturday organizing team, so we just had, for SQL Saturday Atlanta. We usually have our event in May. As David said, these are fantastic events. They're absolutely free, and you can see some pretty amazing speakers at those events. My blog is in transition. I had a blog on SQLteam.com. That's been archived. You can still access those if you want. My new blog would be at sqlr.io. It'll probably look like SQL Rio, but it's meant to be sqlr.io. I don't have a date as to when that will be available, but any follow-up material I might have on this presentation would be at that address. And my Twitter handle is SQL_R, and you can email me at that name at outlook.com if you had any follow-up questions. And I can bring that back up at the end if we need to. So what I wanted to do first is I wanted to go over some fundamentals for people who may not be familiar with them, beginners, and this will only take a couple minutes, but it's important to understand what log shipping is about, the mechanism behind it and the concept behind it. So I'm going to discuss the database and transaction log portions of SQL Server, a SQL Server database. I'll also go into backing up and restoring very briefly, just to show you how it's done and how it interacts with and how it's the foundation of the log shipping feature. Because what we're doing is we're restoring transaction log backups to other servers. I'll go into some ideas and scenarios about what you can use log shipping for, and you can use them for read-only. You can use them to upgrade your hardware. You can move your databases to new hardware. You can have read-only copies for reporting purposes. I'll also go into a bit about monitoring and troubleshooting in case you're using log shipping, and then you can see some of the tools available for you to keep an eye on it. And I'll briefly discuss the last two items, only because I don't really have demos for them, but I can explain how you can customize log shipping. You don't necessarily have to use the built-in feature. You can write your own sequence to back up and restore, and then you can also look at some of the other options available beyond log shipping with database mirroring and the availability groups feature in SQL Server. So it's sort of an extension to what what log shipping can do. So to start off with the basics of a SQL Server database, there's two types of files. You have a data file. Traditionally, they'll have an MDF or NDF extension. I believe it means main data file, or secondary data file. And this is a structured file that has, it's divided into 8 kilobyte pages. And all of your database structure, the actual data is stored on these pages. If you have indexes, they're stored on these pages. There's also a number of system structures, metadata structures, that are also stored on 8K pages. And some of those manage how the other 8K pages are allocated. So you may have a database with 1,000 pages in it, and only 20 of them or 30 of them are allocated. So there's pages within that structure to tell you how those are used. The second part, and the part that's most important for log shipping, is the transaction log file. This is not structured with 8K pages. This is actually subdivided into sections. Typically, it'll have an LDF extension for log file. There are segments within a transaction log file called virtual log files. And these segments allow the transaction log to reuse space more effectively once, say, transactions are completed. I'm not going to go into the details too much about that. I do have some reference material at the end if you want to learn more about them. And instead of storing actual data, the transaction log will store the changes that you are making to the database. It's literally a log, like you write down, what I'm going to do today. The end result would be stored in the data file, but the sequence of events, the actions that would cause that, would be stored in the transaction log. And the key thing for SQL Server, most relational database products use a concept known as write-ahead logging. What you do is, before you go and change the database, you make a log of the changes in a separate file, a separate structure. And that's what the transaction log would do. And I'll have an example of that on the next slide. But any type of data operation that would write to the database, if I'm going to insert rows or update rows or delete them, those actions are written into a log format and then stored in the transaction log. And then once those are committed, the database engine will go and actually change the database structures to reflect what those changes say they should. So if I update my age on my birthday from my current age to my current age +1, you would see an update log record. The reason you have this is by logging everything before you make the commitment to the actual data files, it allows you to have the durability of what's known as the ACID features of a database. You're making sure that your transactions are durable on disk. So you have two different sources, the database and the transaction log. And if I have a system crash, since everything was written to the transaction log before it went to the database, I can start up my database, look at the log, and find transactions that were actually committed in the log. So I started at A, I did B, C, D, and so on, and I got until step Z. So all of those steps were completed. I can roll that transaction forward into the data files so that that whole transaction is complete and all of the work is finalized. If I crashed during an unfinished transaction, let's say I got from A until Q, let's say, so there's no committed transaction log record. So all of those intermediate changes, any that might have been done in the database, have to be undone. So part of that is, again, to make sure that a transaction is committed and it's all or nothing. It's not left in an inconsistent state. So if you think in terms of a cash register, I'm not sure how great this analogy is, but if you think about a cash register in a store, you have that little paper tape inside of the machine that actually keeps track of all of the transactions. So I went and bought some soup and some cereal, and there's a line item there. Here's what you bought. Here's how much it cost. Here's how much you paid for it. And then in the case of a redo, if I had to figure out, okay, how much money am I supposed to have in the drawer, I could replay those transactions and take out the money that's supposed to be taken out. If I return something, I can put the material back on the shelf as inventory if I can, and then figure out the monetary transactions. So that's sort of the idea of a transaction log, is it keeps track of all of the little changes you make. And then the cash drawer would be the database. This is the money that you have after all of those transactions were done. So I mentioned I'm actually saving the change. In this case, I'm going to make a change to Hamlet. And I'm going to go find to be or not to be. That is the question. So I go write down what I'm going to do. So that little section that I have highlighted there in red is I'm going to go find that scene. I'm going to change to be or not to be. That is the question. And change it to be or not to be. Is that a question? So now that I've altered Shakespeare, and I've written down how I was going to alter it, I'm saving that in a transaction log. I would actually put that on a separate piece of paper from the actual text of Hamlet. That's my change log. Once I have that change log, I want to say, you know what? I don't want to lose track of this. I'm going to make basically a Xerox copy of that. And that's my log backup. So you can see the same text where I had the action there is in the arrow. That would get saved to disk somewhere. And that's my transaction log backup. And it contains a record of those changes that I've made. And by doing this, is now that I have that, when I go to restore a database, for whatever reason, I can restore those sequence of events and those changes take place in the database as they're supposed to. And that's basically the gist of it, is I have a stream of data modification activity, and that's maintained in my transaction log and also in my transaction log backups. So now when I want to go into a demo here and show the backup and restore operations that we would use to get log shipping started. So a full database backup is pretty much what it says. It's the entire database. So it would be all of the cash in the drawer of say, a cash register, but actually the whole structure of the cash register, not just the money. So I could reproduce a cash register somewhere else. And also, while I'm backing that up, if there's any database activity during the backup operation, if you have a large database, it might take a few minutes, the transaction log is also included in that full backup. So any changes that I'm making, if anybody's buying or selling anything, I can get that activity in that full backup. And then I can restore that somewhere, and that will be the state of the database at the end of the backup operation. It will include all of the operations. Afterwards, I would take transaction log backups, and this would just be capturing the transaction log activity. It would not look at the database file. It's just getting the transaction log file. So basically just the register tape, the paper tape. The other thing a backup will do in the transaction log is if I back up the register tape, I could basically say, okay, I've copied everything up until this point. And then the tape itself wouldn't necessarily be a continuous roll of tape. It would sort of be like a loop of tape. So I could, in essence, erase what's already been backed up on that tape and then rewrite on it. And this just allows me to, instead of having to keep getting a longer and longer tape, I can just reuse the tape. That's marking the virtual log files as reusable. And that's when you get into a situation, if you don't back up frequently enough, there are no more reusable segments and the log file would have to grow. There's a type of copy only backup you can make that would not mark those VLFs as reusable. So I'll just mention that as something to keep in mind. And I'm not going to go over differential or file group backups, but they're another type of backup that's available to you if you're doing those in your backup and recovery strategy. So what I'll do is I'll switch over to Management Studio, and I'll set up a new database and do some manual backup steps. Okay. Just see if I created it already. I did create it already. Okay. So I have logship_demo. I made sure that I set the recovery model to full. I need to keep full recovery model so that all transactions are logged, fully logged in the transaction log. Because if I don't and I lose segments, then I can't restore them properly. So I've already made a full backup here, and it kind of looks like this. And I just basically say which database I want and give it a file name and some other settings. And what I'll do now is I'm going to go into that database, logship demo. I'm going to create a sample data table and insert some data in there. Before I insert some data, I'm going to make a backup file here, and I'm just giving it a timestamp here. This is just formatting the current date and time so that I can find it by date and time and order it by file name. And I gave it a little description here to say, hey, this is the first log backup, and all it will contain is a database. And then I insert some sample data there. I believe that's already in there, so let me go down a little bit. So all of these backups have been made, and I'm going to select from sample data. And I have a job running that inserts data periodically, so that's already added some data. So basically, my demo was going to show you up to the 6th row, all of the data up through, I think the 3rd row had been backed up, and the 4th through the 6th rows had not been backed up. Let me go into my other database, standard. So now what I want to do is go into setting up the log shipping for that. So I can right-click on the database that I want to log ship and choose the ship transaction logs feature here. And you'll get a wizard here. I'm hoping this will show up okay. If the text is small, I apologize. I'm not going to be able to zoom it effectively because I think it'll just get too big. Yeah, I think that's going to be a little too big. So I just go through the steps here of enabling this as a primary database in a log shipping configuration. What I want to do here in my backup settings is I'm going to basically specify where my backup files are going to be made, and I also need a network path to where my secondaries can access those backups. So let me get that value real quick here. So I set up a share. This is all on my laptop, so these will all be pretty local, but you would probably use a different machine name instead of your local name and share out a path there, or have a network admin or some other administrator set that up for you. So that's going to be the remote path. That's where all the backup files will be copied to. And then when I go to actually make the backups, they would go into this local folder on the primary. So that way now I got a backup job, it'll go to that folder, and then it will use that as a source. They happen to be the same folder, but this is basically where I'm going to make the backups to, and this is where they're going to get copied to. I'm going to just change these retention settings a little bit, make them 2 hours old. I'm going to change the schedule. I'm going to actually make this 2 minutes. Click OK. So what I'm saying here is I want this database backed up every 2 minutes, or I want the transaction log backed up every 2 minutes. So that way I only have a 2-minute window between when changes are made. And then I get into I got the backup settings set, and now I want to add my secondary databases. So this would be where I would add a new server and say, I want this database replicated to this server. So this is basically a named instance. It's a standard edition SQL Server. And I'm going to say, yes, I want to initialize this by setting up a full backup of the primary database and then restore it to the secondary. And that's pretty easy to do. Give me a moment to get a folder name here. And since I have a different folder structure here, I would want to tell the wizard when it goes to do the backup which folder path to restore the database files and the log files. Because I don't want them in the same folder, obviously, because the databases would conflict with each other. So I click on that. So now this is ready to do the full backup and restore. This is where I want to have a destination folder for copy files. It's going to be in backup secondary. I pasted that before. And then I'll tell it, I want to, after the files have been copied, I want to have an interval where they're deleted so you don't have an accumulation of files, which could be thousands or so, depending on how many databases you have. I'll have them delete after 2 hours. And then once again, I'm going to change the schedule for the purposes of this demo because I would like you to see some of this happen. I'm just going to offset that by 1 minute. Actually, offset that by 30 seconds. So I'm going to copy files every 2 minutes, and I'm going to back up every 2 minutes. And when I'm done, I'm going to click OK. And it goes through the process of backing up logship demo, restoring it to the secondary database server. So as you can see, yeah, there's the STD name there, standard instance, and I think it even popped up right here in standard. So I found that I've now got a database here that's now in a restoring state. So I've backed up the current status, the current data is in there, and I've got a duplicate now of the same database on another, in essence, another server, even though it's all on my local laptop. And that's pretty much it. That's how fairly easy it is to set up a log shipping database using the wizard. And there's again, there's some links I'll have later. You can go through an example, walk through that, or watch the video afterwards if it's visible. So now that you've set up a log shipping feature, so what kind of what does it offer you as a feature in SQL Server? And basically, I had a demonstration I was going to do of manually restoring, but I figured for the sake of time, I would just mention that what you're really doing is when you want to restore databases to another server for whatever reason, this is automating that process. This is taking all of your transaction log backups. It's keeping track of which ones have been restored and where they've been restored, and it's just automating all of that for you. So you don't have to manually go through a process. Say, for instance, you have a disaster and you need to bring up a new server somewhere. If you've ever had to do that, it's sort of a pain to have to query the backup history, figure out which files are where, possibly copy them somewhere else. And this feature does all of that for you. And what you can do is then have, say, a log shipped secondary somewhere, and then you can make that available as what's known as a warm standby or just a plain old standby server. And that's something that you can fail over to that if you want to. In case your primary goes down, you can just restore that quickly, and now it's a writable copy that you can use and just change a connection string or however you connect to your application connects to your database. One of the really nice features that log shipping supports is the fact that you are not limited by how many replicas you have, how many replica servers, how many replica databases. You can put copies on the same server if you want. I don't know if the wizard does that well, but yeah, you can just tell it, hey, I want to have a log ship secondary on the same server. Usually you would put it on different servers. It's also available in pretty much every edition of SQL Server, at least the editions that have the SQL agent feature available. So the Express edition, unfortunately, does not have that built in. One other thing to remember, though, is when you get to a particular version of SQL Server, you can only restore backups to that version or a higher version. You can't restore downward. You can't go from, say, SQL Server 2016 to 2014. You would have to go to 2016 or 2017 or 2019. You also have an option, I forgot to set that up in there, was the readable secondary. And what that means is I can restore in a standby mode, and the log has been restored so that I can still restore logs over it, but now the database is readable. So I can actually query that database on the replica. And this is great for if you have a reporting server, if you want to make replica reporting available and spread out your reporting load. And I'll come back to something I set up is you can also adjust how often or how far behind your log files are restored. So if you wanted to have, say, a standby server, and let's say it's say restored up until the past hour or the past 12 hours, past 24 hours. One of the nice things about that is that's what we call the oh crap situation. And that's where someone accidentally dropped a table in production, and it would take a long, long time to restore the full process if you had to restore the database manually. In this case, you have a delayed replica. You can go and find the data before it got dropped, and you can basically pull out the things that you need to put back into the primary, and you can just use that as a data source to do that rather than having to do a restoration. You can also, as you saw, I set up the recovery time to be every 2 minutes and the restore time to be every 2 minutes. So you can adjust how often these jobs run. It might be a case where you can't necessarily synchronize continuously. You might have to pick certain windows where either network traffic or other kinds of criteria dictate how often you can restore to a replica somewhere or copy files or something like that. So all of that is controlled by the SQL agent jobs and their schedules. So their schedules can be different intervals, 5 minutes, an hour, 24 hours, however you need them. The other thing is that the MSDB database has all of the stored procedures and the system tables that it needs to support the log shipping feature in SQL Server. So you saw me demonstrate the GUI and the user interface, and that wizard does all of the work behind the scenes. You can script out all of that activity into a script file. I can show you how that looks like, because once you script that out, now you can start playing around with it, and you can just run the script, change a few settings, instead of having to go through clicking and nexting and all that to get another database added. One other thing too, which I kind of just realized putting these slides together, is log shipping is the only feature, the replication feature, data replication feature in SQL Server that does not actually impact the transaction log activity. I'll come back to that when I discuss some of the other features. But basically it's things like replication and change data capture. If things go wrong with those functions and they're no longer being replicated, they may hold records in the transaction log, and that could cause the transaction log to grow. And log shipping does not interfere in that way. It will not affect what goes on in the transaction log. It actually helps because it's using existing backups. It's making regular backups and then applying them somewhere else. So it has a lot of advantages versus, say, availability groups. There are times when something could go wrong in availability groups, and the log may start growing out of control. So I mentioned a standby server as one of the uses for there. And I can, as I described before, you can use them for reporting. You can use them as a warm standby where you can fail over in case you needed something, your server went down for some reason. You can actually fail over to the standby database, standby server in this case. And then you would just change a connection string to point to the new, what is now the new primary server. So that's a high availability option, maybe not high availability, because there's kind of limits, practical limits to how often you can restore transaction logs. But it's a very good option for disaster recovery, where you can put new servers in a different data center or just a different location somewhere in case there's a physical thing, the building's on fire, or some other kind of instance where you can no longer get into the physical space. Company I used to work at had their data center in Long Island during Hurricane Sandy, and they had about 5 or 6 feet of water in the first floor. Fortunately, everything was on the second floor, but the power went out in the building, and it was out for a couple of weeks. So we needed to move this to another data center. We'd actually already had it in another data center already. But that's something you could use log shipping for, is take all your backups, get them to another site, and restore them. And then you can pull everything back up and start working from there. Let me go into bear with me one moment. I just want to pull up a sample script here. What I wanted to show was the replication state of the databases. As I said before, hold on. Offset data. Okay. So I mentioned as part of it is having the delay. I set up an offset database, and this was delayed by about 15 minutes. So the secondary was scheduled to be 15 minutes behind. What I wanted to show, and it's only picking up with this one database. So as you can see, I put a timestamp in the table here of the current time when it was inserted, and I'm comparing it to the current time now, and you'll see that of the most recent rows, everything's at least 15 minutes old. If I had set up this one to be standby, cheat real quick. I do want to demo this. This is what's known as typing in a demo, and you're never supposed to do that. I'll give this a minute. I'll just let this run. Because this is actually cool. I promise this is really cool. Let's get this started. Okay. So this is where, again, we have a delay. Transaction logs. Enable backup. Let me go back to my slides. Let me come back to that. I cover the DR situation. Disaster recovery is, again, to replace an environment or situation where the hardware is no longer available. You cannot continue doing business in that particular location. High availability is to handle basically a local failure of some kind. Power supply, someone kicks the plug out of the back of a server, let's say. So that server goes down, and what you're doing with most scenarios is that you're replicating your databases to another physical server, maybe a virtual server. There's different ways of doing that, but it's basically maintaining the data between two separate pieces of hardware. That would be considered a high availability situation. And again, with log shipping, is that you can have multiple replicas. So I can put this on 2 machines, 3 machines, 4 machines, and keep them all synchronized as frequently as I'd like to do them. And if one machine goes down, or let's say we have to patch something, I can then go into the database and restore it to a state to where it's now writable, so that people can now come in and start writing to that particular copy of it, and then I can do whatever I need to do to what is now a secondary database, and then continue operations with the new primary replica. And again, I mentioned you can put this on multiple servers. You could keep it on the same server if you wanted to, but it's not particularly useful to do that. And you can adjust your recovery point objective. That's what RPO means. The recovery point indicates to what, basically how late or how recent is your data. And that would be, say, up to 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago. And that's something that you would have agreed to ahead of time with your business folks, the people that are responsible for the application. And we'd say, look, I can keep your data fresh up until, say, 5 or 10 minutes ago, maybe 1 hour. 1 hour might be agreeable for them. They don't necessarily need to be real time. And then you can, again, fail over, move your system over to the replica and use that as the writable primary. If it's an hour out of date, that might be acceptable to the business. The RTO, the recovery time objective, is how long does it take you to get to that state? Can you bring your database online within 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes? This is where, when you're setting up something for high availability, you'd want to discuss that with the business so that they understand what's available to you. This may not necessarily be something log shipping would do, but it's something where you now, based on those figures, recovery point and recovery time, what solution you're going to use to accomplish that. And something, say, again, within an hour or 30 minutes or even 15 minutes may be accomplished with log shipping. Again, I mentioned, yeah, you can have servers in the same data center as replicas. You can also ship them off to a remote data center. There's some networking that you'd have to work out there, but that's an option for you as well. Let me go to next. And one last one that I found very, very handy for log shipping is whenever I have to upgrade either the hardware or just move something to a new SQL Server instance, and that would become the new primary. I don't necessarily use the log shipping feature to do this, but I set up my own automated log restore process. So it's actually log shipping, it's just not using the wizard and the built-in Microsoft feature. And it also is very nice for upgrading from an old version of SQL Server to a new one, where I can go in, set up the new servers with the new version, restore the logs to the new version, leave them in a recovery state so that I can keep applying log backups. And then when I'm finally done, we just restore the last log, bring the new databases up with recovery, they're now writable, and then go from there. Also, if you're interested or using database mirroring or availability groups, you can log ship to a server that will use them as replicas. And because you basically need to do that anyway when you initialize the replicas, it's one way of doing it to where you can do this ahead of time and you can minimize the amount of time to fail over to a new server. Oh, look at that. I reached my demo. I did my demo slides before the demo. So let me come back to this and open up my script and get the databases and get the paths that I should keep copying. So get this going here. Slideship demo. 2 minutes. After. Standard. So I'm going to demo this one more time, just in case. Sorry about this. Should have saved this as a script. So there's a lesson for you. If you do presentations, script everything out so you don't have to do this and take time away from it. If anyone has any questions, if you wanted to post it in there, David, if you see any questions I might be able to answer while I'm typing all this out at the second time.
Right now, I think we're good. If anybody has any additional questions that we can answer while he's finishing this up, just let us know. Put it in the chat window there. We'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, schedule. 2 minutes. Restore transaction log, standby mode. So I mentioned before, if you wanted to have a readable secondary, you can restore your databases in a standby mode. that allows you to read the database at the point where the log was restored. I don't want to see the schedule. Put this in 1 minute after. Okay. So that's what I forgot to check last time. So I'm going to have the second database, and it will be readable in standby mode once I get this created. Click OK. Actually, script action in the query window. That didn't script all that much. Okay. I do have a script that I can pull up, so let me grab that real quick here. So when I use the GUI to set up the database, it basically generates all of this SQL behind the scenes. So you can see that this is all handled through stored procedures, and they'll just take parameters for, like, say, the name of the database, the paths that we typed in before, names of the job, all of your retention periods, and so on. So all of this, once you get it again into a script, you can start putting basically variables in here. You can declare parameters or variables, and that way you can customize how you want to set up log shipping so that you don't have to go through the GUI each time. And all of this is pretty boilerplate as far as that goes. I'm going to drop this. So now I can see that the second demo database that I had, the 2 underscores, is in standby mode. So when I run this offset script, when I want to check the databases, you can see now, so I set the 15-minute offset demo database, so it doesn't have anything more recent than 15 minutes ago. But the new one, logship demo, has already gotten some data inserted, and it's only off by, in this case, 2 minutes. And if I run it again, it'll probably, yeah, just because the restore interval is every 2 minutes. So if I run this again, you'll see in another minute or so that this, it'll probably go up to number 9. It'll have the date in there, and it'll probably say like -1 minute or minus 2 minutes again, but with new data. So I'll come back to that in a second. So we went through 876 in logship demo, and then 176 there. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Slides here. So a couple things I want to show, and actually want to show a failover as well. But I wanted to mention that you don't necessarily have to do this all through SQL. You can also use PowerShell. PowerShell's been around for about 12 years now with Microsoft, and it's basically their way of administering SQL Server in a programmatic way. Not SQL Server, but Windows, all of their platforms in general, including Azure, if you're going into the cloud. And it's basically a consistent set of commands, and you can interact with SQL Server using regular PowerShell, or if you really, really want to get powerful, there's a package called DBA Tools that I highly, highly recommend. A lot of people highly recommend. They really make a lot of things easier. And they do have some log shipping features here, and I should be able to demo that. Also, I'm going to show you some monitoring queries so that you can get a sense of how to make sure that your log shipping is functioning the way you want. There's also a log shipping report that I'll show. So let me come back to that slide after I go into the monitoring portion. So what I'd like to do is I want to see how my log shipping is doing. I've got two databases that are being shipped. I can go down to reports, and go to standard reports, and this is when you right-click on the server, and it seems all the way at the bottom. I think it's alphabetical. You have a transaction log shipping status report. So I've used that in the past. So I'll just use the report shortcut. I don't want the blocking activity. So I'm running transaction log shipping, and what it has done is it's basically run a query behind the scenes, and it's looking at the status of everything that's been restored, all of the logship databases. So let's see, my first logship demo, my second logship demo, the underscores in them, they're showing the synchronized correctly. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit here, just to make that a little bit bigger. Okay. Bear with me 1 second as I scroll carefully. Here we go. So you can get, you see that the name of the server, the database names, and their backup times, the threshold for alerting, and whether an alert is enabled or not. You can also go and look at, in this case, the logship demo database without any underscores is 1,400 minutes behind, so that's like 24 hours behind. So that job got messed up somehow, and I haven't been able to recover it. So it's got an alert enabled. It's probably tried to alert me. I just don't have email set up on this. And it will even tell you the last backup file that was restored. So this is probably a really quick and easy way to get the information you need on how your log shipping is doing for the databases involved. You can run that on the primary, which I did up here, and I can run the same report on the secondary. So this wouldn't necessarily tell you the restore scenario on the secondary because I'm running it on the primary. This just tells you when it was last backed up, not when it was last restored or copied. We run this on the secondary, and you'll see similar, where the underscore databases are in good shape. They're being copied regularly, so it was only a minute ago they were last copied. One was just restored within the last minute. It was only 2 minutes old. And if I keep going over here, it'll even tell you, here's the last files that I've copied and restored on the report. So this is, if you start seeing issues where data is more out of date, further out of date than you expect it to, probably just run this report right off the bat and go take a look at what it's saying, what it's telling you here. You can start diagnosing where, oh, the network might have been out, files might have gotten moved or changed or something, or something else may have occurred that caused the log shipping to stop working correctly. You can also, as I showed here, 176 and 8, so I'm going to just query this real quick, and you can see that the data has incremented. It's still 15 minutes behind on that server, and now it's 5 minutes behind when it really shouldn't be more than 5 minutes behind. So there might actually be something going on there. You can also query the system tables. Get these two scripts here. So if you wanted to find all of the log shipping features here, you can query the system tables, and you'll see here that there's a number of objects in MSDB that keep track of all of your log shipping stuff. So there's a number of tables here, log shipping primary databases, secondaries, and so on. You can query these as you would a normal table and get details on your specific server. So let me just switch this to do the primary first. So I'm going to query these two here, log shipping primary databases and the confusing log shipping primary secondaries. So it indicates here are your actual primary databases. It's got a GUID here that it uses for some other features here, but it actually tells you where everything gets backed up, how long the retention period is. It'll give you the name, the ID of the job, if you have a monitor server or not, and so on. And some of this would show up in the report, but it definitely tells you when the last backup file was made and the last date. So this is very helpful for seeing if there's something wrong in the primary where the backups are not being made. For instance, you may have run out of disk space, let's say. It would tell you when the last backup succeeded. Then I go and can look at the secondaries, and in this case, so this ID up here, this primary ID, this tells me where the secondary server is and the name of the database on the secondary. So now I can start to see how many secondaries there are for a particular primary database. And if I switch to the secondary server, I have similar tables here, and these keep track of the secondary settings. So this is sort of the logical complement to that. And this will tell you, again, where backups are stored, retention, the copy and restore job IDs, so you can go into SQL Agent and find these. And again, the secondary databases are there. And you get the same sort of detail as you had before. That's what I needed. I need a... check log shipping history. There's also, in history, there's a history detail table. And this gives you a lot more detail on the activities here. And this one's actually probably a little bit too much data, but it would give you all of the specifics about basically what you would see in the job output. So it will tell you the restore operation was successful. It deleted the old backup files and so on. And you can go through this and you can use this if you need more detail than what the report might offer. The other thing you can do is, outside of log shipping, you can also look at the actual restore history of any database, really. In this case, I'm going to look at the actual restores for offset demo. So I can see the actual history, regardless of whether it was log shipped or not, and I can get the date and so on. So that's something you can use for more detailed monitoring if you're not getting enough feedback from the report. David, how much time do we have left? I have about, I think it says about 6 minutes.
Yeah, 6 or 7 minutes, but if we need to go a few minutes over, that's no problem.
Okay. So I put this table together just to give a comparison to, again, when you're using high availability or disaster recovery solutions, the three main ones that SQL Server has offered for that was log shipping, database mirroring, and availability groups. So log shipping has a really old history. It was available before version 2000. I don't think it was a built-in feature. It was just something that a gentleman by the name of Bill Wander, and I have a link for his blog later, put together this really nice set of scripts where you could basically automate all of the things that log shipping automates. So you can keep standby copies of databases, and it works with really old versions. They finally added it to SQL Server in, I think, version 2000, possibly version 7.0. So it's a very well-established technique and feature. It didn't have, say, the real-time replication that customers wanted. Microsoft added database mirroring in version 2005, I think with a service pack, but it was only available with the Enterprise Edition of SQL Server. So that's one of the nice advantages that log shipping has, is other than the Express edition, you can log ship to any edition between any edition of SQL Server. The only limitation there would be that the versions have to be compatible. Meaning you have to be able to restore to the same or a higher version. The availability groups feature enhanced what database mirroring allowed, because database mirroring you could not read from the replica, and availability groups made that a feature. But again, most of those were only available in the Enterprise Edition, and the Standard Edition, what they call basic availability groups, basically works the same as database mirroring. You can't read from the replica. You can have multiple replicas, though, so there's some advantage there. There's also the simplicity of log shipping, because the only external resource that you need to get log shipping going is that UNC path where the backup files are copied. When you set up database mirroring and availability groups, you have to have some additional network things that you may have to open up additional ports in your firewall. If you want to have automatic failover, you need a witness of some kind, what you would call a quorum. In the case of availability groups, the cluster will maintain the quorum. Database mirroring would have a third SQL server that would communicate, and if something went wrong with one of the servers, it would control whether it would fail over or not. So that's what's necessary to give you an automatic failover feature that log shipping does not have built in. There's probably ways you can detect whether or not to fail over to a replica and to restore it. I don't have a demo of that. I'm still working out the logic for that. And based on the action that you have to restore a transaction log, which is restoring from a file of some kind, I wouldn't necessarily recommend log shipping for, say, continuous data synchronization. Database mirroring and availability groups, they replace the UNC path with a network endpoint. They're basically the same thing. They're an endpoint to where, hey, where can I get this juicy transaction log data from? In the case of mirroring and availability groups, it actually comes directly over the network. So they don't have to read it from the file system. It's basically being sent from the primary directly to a mirror or a replica. So that's where if you can't afford or you don't want to deal with the overhead of these two, you might be able to do something with log shipping to reduce your RPO and RTO to something that's near continuous, say within 30 seconds or a minute. That would be something you'd have to experiment with, but it's an option that you can try. So I wanted to cover also customizing log shipping. As you saw that I had the script there, you can take that script and you can start changing things around a little bit. You may not want to log ship to the same database name. So I had that as the offset 15 database. I had went in and changed the database name there from the original. So you can customize the script. Or you might be in a situation where the features that log shipping offer are not going to work with the environment you're in. For instance, your secondaries may not be routable over your network. They might be in physical data centers that can't communicate with each other via the UNC feature. Uniform name, something? So that double/path that you saw won't work in your particular environment. You may be in a situation I was in a few years ago. We had a data center in the UK, and that was a physical host. We had to move the databases to Azure. That data center had no outbound paths to go to Azure. We could remote into it over a remote session, but we couldn't connect to Azure through that. What we had to do was take our backup files, put them onto an FTP site, and it had to be done through secure FTP, not even regular FTP. So it was not going to work with the way the log shipping wizard was set up. Another issue is my production is now in Azure. We run SQL Server on virtual machines, so it's very convenient to back up my databases to a URL rather than to a local drive and then copy them somewhere else. And now the URL, I can now restore from that URL pretty much anywhere. But backing up and restoring to a URL is not supported in log shipping and SQL Server. So maybe ask them to add that feature. So that's something where you would have to write a bit of code to basically do some of these where you could basically query the backup history. I had that in the log shipping history. So I mentioned before, you can query the restore history to see when the database was restored. You can do that by name. I can go to the primary and also get the backup history of the original. Let's scroll down a little bit here. So I'm looking at the backup history for offset demo. And you can see, here's the database. It's a full database. That's the D type. Here's the name of the backup file that was used. So you can use this query to construct a restore sequence. Probably the easiest way to do this would be if you're able to set up a linked server between two servers. You could run this query on a linked server and get this detail here, and then you can construct, if you were able to say access them through a UNC path, you could construct the sequence that you need. So I could just basically take, here's all my backup history on the primary, and compare it to my restore history, and basically just take out anything that hasn't been restored yet. So you can compare those two, and then from that you'll have a list of files that have not been restored yet, and then you can just construct a restore statement automatically to restore them. I do have this in a production environment. Unfortunately, I'd have to clean it up a little bit to make it available. Hopefully I will have that posted on my blog once that's done. One other wrinkle on I mentioned we had the UK data center and had to move everything to Azure. We also also had some backup software that they had bought that was no longer available, and it was not supported on the newer versions of SQL Server. They stopped supporting it after, I think, version 2005. So we had to add this step where we copied the backup over to the Azure destination. We had to basically uncompress it and decrypt it and then restore it manually. So these additional steps were not supported by the log shipping feature. And lastly, if you wanted to, if you had smaller databases and you wanted to use them with Express Edition, because again, Express Edition doesn't have SQL Agent included, you can still restore the databases. You just have to find a different way of automating that restore process. And that's something you could do with a scheduled task in Windows. It can do, as I showed you before, you can query, there's all of the backup files, compare it to the restored files, find the difference, and generate a restore script to bring it up to synchronization. So I mentioned before continuous log shipping, and this is where you get into, say, database mirroring and availability groups. I'll leave this here. You can review this on, say, YouTube or something like that, or if I post the slides later. So these are the features that database mirroring added over log shipping. Some of the overhead that you have to work with, some of the limitations. It's important to remember that this is now a deprecated feature, I think as of version 2012, since availability groups has been added. So there won't be any changes to this feature. It may or may not actually be dropped, but it's not going to be recommended or supported by Microsoft anymore. You would only keep using database mirroring if you're on a version prior to 2012, and those are now all out of support, so you'd probably want to migrate. Availability groups it's basically database mirroring on steroids, where it gives you readable replicas, but it manages all of the communication via clustering, Windows failover clustering. And that adds a little bit of complication to it. And I'll go over some of those in a moment. David, do I have another, say, 5 to 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, there's some advantages over log shipping, mostly in the automatic failover, where, again, there's a quorum between the replicas that tell them, hey, this one is not responding anymore. If it's the principal replica, what we'll do is we'll just say, hey, that's no longer available, and now I can move the service over to another replica that's available, and you can start writing to that replica. You don't have to do any log restores or any database restores. It'll just automatically take care of that for you, and it will keep synchronizing with the other replicas. In other words, they'll know that this is now the new primary, and it'll start accepting the replication traffic from that primary. So this is basically the cool kid. This is the one you would use if you needed to maintain, say, real-time or near real-time and automated failover. So I mentioned, as you saw before, you have the transaction log status report. You have some of the monitoring tables and some queries you can write against them. So here's some things that, some of these actually came up when I was setting up some demos. Things that you have to basically prerequisites and ways of troubleshooting some things. You would, as you saw before, you would need a backup path for the backups to be stored on the primary server. One thing that trips up me a lot is when I run SQL Server under a particular service account, I have to make sure that it actually has file permissions to write, read, write, and delete from those paths, because the SQL agent jobs will run under a service account. And if you don't add those permissions to those folders, the jobs might fail. You'll probably get an error that will tell you that. The same applies to that shared path, the one with the double backslash. When you set up a share, you would also set up sharing permissions, and then you would tell it, whether it can read or write for that account. So I goofed on my original demo setup where I didn't type in the correct path. So the job was running. It wasn't actually reporting an error, but it wasn't copying anything because the path didn't exist. That's something that you might want to take a look at your job history and just validate that things are backing up and restoring, or if there's an error that you deal with it. If you have specific network settings. You might have firewalls in place that don't allow copying over UNC path. I think there's a port for that that might need to be opened up or changed somehow. Also, you have an option of initializing a secondary from an existing backup. It doesn't have to take a new backup. If you do use that, though, you have to make sure you get all of the backups after the full backup is used. So I forgot to do that on my original logship demo, and there's like 2 or 3 additional log backups in place. I had not restored them on the secondary, and the job was, again, not failing, but it also wasn't restoring anything. Once I restored all of that log chain to the point where now the logship backups could take over, and it just synchronized right away. So that's just something to keep in mind. It might be safer to just initialize everything from a new backup. And a big one that's going to come up pretty much with any database is you want to try to get your transaction log to a size that's large enough to handle all of your transaction activity so that it won't automatically grow or limit how much growth it needs. This happens with the other replication services, with mirroring and with availability groups, is that they have activity that will hold information in the transaction log. If a replica is not available to receive data, it won't clear out the log until that replica is back online. And this came in, that bit me really hard. We had a remote replica in an availability group that just stopped synchronizing, and we had hundreds of gigabytes of log, and the file kept growing, and therefore the log backups kept getting larger as well. Not just the transaction log, but the backups kept including the same data, until we finally just kicked that replica out, and then we were able to make a regular backup, and it cleared it out, and we were able to shrink it. And I mentioned earlier, so that's, again, log maintenance is not just backing things up, it's keeping track of the size. You can look at the log shipping status report. That'll help you out. I showed the restore history queries to make sure that the restores are happening. Someone could manually back up and restore a log shipping database without using the wizard, without using the SQL agent jobs for log shipping. So that could happen, and that could break your log shipping from that point forward. So that's one thing you might want to take a look at as well. Also, if you see that things are not synchronizing and the reports or the queries are not giving you enough detail, you can look in SQL agent history, and you can look and see if there's any messages or errors in the SQL agent, and you can also check the SQL Server error log, because that would give you information on whether backups are happening. If there's an error of some kind, it'll usually have some details in those logs. So I mentioned again, restore history. If you compare the log shipping detail, let's see, you'd have to work out which records you want from the monitor history detail. But if I run this on the secondary, let's say, and then I compare the history detail to the restore history, you might find discrepancies there. This may show you some errors or issues where files were not copied, therefore they weren't restored. And that way you can start looking for other things that might be causing a problem with the log shipping not synchronizing. And again, I mentioned you can restore a database over log shipping. It's completely independent. It doesn't know or care that you're log shipping a database. It doesn't lock it down. So that could break log shipping. And if you were to change your database recovery model, let's say you changed it to simple or bulk logged or something like that because you wanted to do a very large data import or data modification, and you wanted it to go more efficiently and more quickly, unfortunately, this will break your log chain. Your log chain is basically a sequence from your first full database backup or a full database backup and all of the subsequent log backups after that. If you change the recovery model, you can no longer use that log chain up until that point was used. You'd have to make a new full backup, and then you would have to restore from that full backup to initialize. Similarly, if you do upgrade to a new version, if you back up on the new version, you can't restore to the earlier version. You'd have to, again, reinitialize. You'd have to make a new full backup on the new version, the newer version. And I mentioned a little bit earlier, a number of SQL Server features work with the transaction log in order to replicate data. That includes the replication feature. transactional and merge replication use the transaction log, and they rely on distributing transactions to multiple servers, but they will hold all of those transactions until the replication agents pick them up and transmit them elsewhere. Change data capture, CDC, similarly, will hold records or can hold records in a transaction log because you're using it to track changes in a more lightweight fashion. So these features here, database mirroring and availability groups as well, may hold on to transactions even though you're taking regular backups. And when a situation comes up where the log cannot be reused, there's this little query here where you can look in the sys databases and it will give you a reuse weight description. You can see if there's something that will tell you either it's replication, log agent, there's a couple of options there. But anything that's not nothing, anything that doesn't show a description of nothing, is a situation where you might have to intervene, maybe resynchronize replication, resynchronize an availability group replica or something like that. And I don't know if it showed up on the query I ran, but there's also those monitor tables that log shipping history detail can very quickly have tens of thousands of rows in it. I've gotten 25,000 rows, I think, in the last 24 hours. And I don't know that those particular tables get cleaned up with the log shipping cleanup. So you might need to go in there and look at deleting data from those on a regular basis. Otherwise, you could end up with hundreds of thousands of rows, and it takes forever to query them. The reports are slower and so on. And that's all I have. Sorry for my demo kind of malfunctioning, but
don't worry, it happens.
There you go.
Do have one good question in here. I've answered a few already through the chat.
Oh, okay.
Can you describe how log shipping affects a normal full and log backup schedule?
So that's a really good question, because in researching this, I found that log shipping is actually done with the wizard. There is an executable called SQL logship.exe. And when you look at the agent jobs, what you'll find is they run as operating system commands. And it will run this command here, SQL logship, and it has a couple of actions. It'll say backup, copy, restore, and so on. And then you could run this yourself from the command line if you put these commands, say, in a batch file or something like that. But that's what the wizard uses. So if you use this, it will basically control your backups. Now, I use a backup routine by a gentleman named Ola Hallengren. I also very highly recommend. He has a bunch of maintenance scripts, and I don't think they're compatible or incompatible with log shipping. I just don't think that they're necessarily compatible with this executable here. So that's one of those little homework things that I would have to check. You could potentially just delete the backup script so that it doesn't run the backup action through SQL logship, and you could just use a normal backup process, and then you would only use the restore on the secondary. So if I came here in SQL agent on the primary, and I go through the wizard, so you'd see these LS backup jobs. You could disable them, you could delete them, and then you could have a more generic backup job that would basically populate the backup history tables, or backup set tables here. So no matter how you back up a database, this data will get populated until you go out and manually delete it. So all of the backup history would be kept here, and that's probably what the logship.exe does. Is it basically queries this table, does actually doesn't need to do a comparison. All it needs to do is generate a backup command. I was even really, really bored. I ran a profiler on it, but you can actually find the actual backup log command in the trace there. So it's just doing this in an executable and following its own naming convention. Maybe for next time I do this, what I would do is disable these, have a normal backup schedule, but unfortunately, they would interfere with or compete with another backup process. You kind of have to make that decision up front, how you're going to do backups, and then experiment with whether disabling these would let you do a restore through the logship restore portion of the SQL logship.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that's all the questions we've got. So I'll let you wrap it up there.
Okay. So thank you very much for attending, and hopefully this won't be the last time I have the issues I had here. So I found some links and some other resources. There's a couple here from Microsoft. They go over log shipping as an overview and also discuss how you can fail over a log shipping secondary. There actually is a PowerShell command that can do that. So if you need to make a secondary into a primary, you can run that PowerShell and it'll take care of all of it. It will run all the jobs to make sure everything's up to date. It will copy all the files over. It'll do the restore database. It's very, very nice. I need to try to demo that. If you want to know more about the transaction log, highly recommend the SQLskills.com folks. Paul Randall, Kimberly Tripp have a lot of stuff on transaction logs internals. There's also a Pluralsight course that Paul recorded. If you have a Pluralsight subscription, you will learn everything about the transaction log. Again, dbatools.io is the site. Easy package to install. Very nice, a lot of commands, not just log shipping. If you also have an interesting story I just came across on log growth, Kevin Hill, really nice guy. He's active on Twitter at that handle. And he has a YouTube video as well that shows what can happen when log files don't get backed up enough and you need to shrink them. And again, I mentioned Bill Wonder. He seems to be the godfather of log shipping because he was doing it with version 6.5, possibly earlier. And that was not a fun process, but he refined all of his scripts, and it wouldn't surprise me if Microsoft basically just took his scripts and just used them. But if you wanted some of the history of it, he explains that link there. You can go look at how it was done 20 years ago. And thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks everybody for attending, and we'll get this video up online here very soon, and we look forward to seeing you all next month. Thanks a lot.